A loaf of bread cost 24 cents in 1970. Today, it is nearly $3. Groceries, rent, housing, subscriptions, a basic life. Everything is more expensive, and you already know that. The explanation you have been given is inflation, maybe corporate greed. But here is what does not add up. American workers are 200% more productive than they were in 1970, and median wages have barely moved. The economy got richer. You did not. That is not a coincidence. It is a design. It is one that took decades to build, and almost nobody talks about how. A recent college graduate scans her grocery receipt. The numbers don't make sense. Bread, eggs, milk, nothing extravagant, just basics. $70 for a basket that would have cost $12 back when her parents were her age. Rent is the next shock. In the 1970s, a typical apartment took about a quarter of a young worker's paycheck. Now, nearly half of renters hand over more than 30% of their income just to keep a roof overhead. Zillow puts the average rent for a modest one-bedroom at $1,650 a month. The math is relentless. Median real weekly earnings hover around $1,423, but rent alone eats up a full week's pay for millions. It isn't just shelter or food. The subscription line items keep multiplying: streaming, cloud storage, fitness apps, even coffee deliveries. Deloitte's numbers show the average American household now juggles almost 3 paid subscriptions, up from just 1 a decade ago. The total spent on these recurring charges has passed $140 billion, growing 10% every year. What used to be a single purchase now becomes a permanent monthly drain. A paycheck is chopped up before it even arrives, sliced into fees for access, convenience, and basic participation in modern life. For many, gig work or side hustles are no longer optional, but survival tools. Nearly 1 in 4 workers now relies on part-time jobs or app-based gigs to fill the gap. Still, the gap keeps growing. Eviction filings hit over 2 million in 2022, a 40% spike from just 3 years earlier. The weight of it all is hard to ignore. Groceries, rent, subscriptions, debt payments. The cost of staying afloat feels engineered to keep you treading water, not swimming ahead. The strangest part is how familiar these struggles have become. The receipts, the rent hikes, the endless list of recurring charges, they are almost background noise. But beneath the surface, there is a deeper pattern. The system wasn't always like this. If inflation alone doesn't explain it, what does? The answer lies in the invisible architecture of the modern economy, a design that quietly rewired the rules of everyday life. In the spring of 2021, the cost of moving a shipping container from Shanghai to Los Angeles hit $5,000. It was a threefold jump from just 2 years before. The Baltic Dry Index, a global barometer for shipping costs, spiked to 4,800 points. Supermarket shelves emptied overnight, and car lots sat barren as semiconductors waited in transit. But these were not isolated glitches. They were the first dominoes in a global chain reaction. Behind the scenes, governments responded with a scale of stimulus never seen before. In the United States alone, nearly $5 trillion poured into the economy through emergency checks, expanded unemployment, and business relief. That is over 20% of the entire GDP in a single burst. Europe, Japan, and the UK followed suit, each unleashing their own fiscal fire hoses. The world's central banks joined in, expanding their balance sheets at record speed. The Federal Reserve's assets more than doubled, peaking at $9.2 trillion by the summer of 2022. Interest rates stayed near zero, making money cheap and borrowing easier than ever. These three forces, supply chain chaos, massive government spending, and ultra-loose monetary policy, collided all at once. Prices surged for everything from plywood to peanut butter. Used cars became more expensive than new ones. Energy costs soared as Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent oil past $120 a barrel. Meanwhile, labor shortages drove up wages in some sectors, fueling a feedback loop of rising costs. But the strange part is what happened next. Even as container ships finally started moving and factories ramped back up, the new higher prices did not simply vanish. Menu costs, long-term contracts, and psychological expectations locked in the increases. Households, flush with stimulus cash but facing scarcity, shifted their spending to goods over services, amplifying the pressure. By late 2022, the initial shocks had faded, but the elevated price tags remained, especially for essentials like food, rent, and healthcare. Some economists called it the perfect storm. Others saw it as an accelerant, not the root cause, because even before the pandemic, the system was primed for this kind of rupture. The deeper story is not just about the past few years, it is about how decades of design made the economy fragile, unequal, and always hungry for more. And that is where the real mystery begins. A new American landscape took shape after World War II, but it wasn't just the product of chance or natural growth. It was engineered, brick by brick, law by law. The GI Bill guaranteed over 2 million VA home loans by 1960, sending a tidal wave of buyers out to the edges of cities. Federal mortgage insurance through the FHA covered more than 2.5 million loans, but it came with strings. Whole neighborhoods, especially Black and immigrant communities, were locked out by underwriting rules and redlining maps. Meanwhile, Congress poured $25 billion into the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, laying down 40,000 miles of interstate roads by the end of the decade. These highways didn't just move cars, they moved people, jobs, and investment out of dense city cores into sprawling, car-dependent suburbs. Local governments followed with a sweeping new rulebook, single-family zoning. By the 1990s, about 70% of all urban residential land in the U.S. was reserved for detached homes on large lots. The effect was invisible but powerful. Urban planners now describe a system where supply is boxed in before a single foundation is poured. Every additional step in the review process feels like a tax on the builder, one Seattle planner observed. Permitting timelines stretched from months to years, and the cost of entry rose with each new regulation. The result was a built environment designed for stability, but one that quietly locked in scarcity. The rules that promised suburban comfort ended up limiting who could participate and how much everyone would ultimately have to pay. But the biggest consequences were still to come. In August 1971, President Nixon took the dollar off gold. Overnight, the world's currencies floated free, and the Federal Reserve was no longer bound by the old rules of scarcity. Money could now be created at will, limited only by political appetite and the confidence of markets. This was the silent birth of the credit age, a world where dollars, euros, and yen became abstractions, untethered from anything physical. But the real shift came later, in 1978, when the Supreme Court decided Marquette National Bank versus First of Omaha. That ruling quietly erased state limits on interest rates for national banks. Suddenly, credit cards and personal loans could be priced as high as the market would bear. Within a decade, household debt in the U.S. doubled. By the early 2000s, credit dependency was a fact of life, not an exception. Then came the financial crisis of 2008. The Federal Reserve responded with a tool that would have been unthinkable in the past: quantitative easing. Trillions of dollars flowed into the system, buying up mortgages and government bonds, lowering rates, and flooding banks with liquidity. By 2022, the Fed's balance sheet had swelled to over $9 trillion. The same pattern played out in Europe, Japan, and the UK, with central banks manufacturing money to keep economies afloat. The result? Leverage became the oxygen of modern finance, fueling everything from home purchases to stock buybacks. Money was no longer scarce. It was elastic, stretching to fill every corner of the economy. But with every new dollar came a new dependency, on cheap credit, on rising asset prices, on the promise that tomorrow would always be bigger than today. The ground had shifted, and almost nobody noticed. What changed next would permanently alter the logic of housing, investment, and everyday survival. Permitting delays have quietly become one of the most powerful forces shaping the price of a home. In cities like San Francisco and Seattle, the time from application to a shovel in the ground has stretched from 12 months in the 1970s to as long as 24 months, and sometimes even 30 months today. Each extra review, every new environmental study, adds cost and uncertainty. A Seattle planner admitted in 2023 that every additional step in the review process feels like a tax on the builder, as projects stall at the 30-day public comment period, with developers unable to absorb the mounting legal fees. The effect is invisible, but relentless. Fewer homes get built, and the ones that do arrive already priced out of reach for most families. But there is another layer to this scarcity. Since the early 2000s, institutional investors, private equity firms, REITs, and corporate landlords have moved in, buying up single-family homes that used to be owned by individual families. By 2023, these investors controlled 13% of all single-family rentals in the US, a 10-fold jump in less than 2 decades. With so much of the supply locked up, the old logic of supply and demand breaks down. Homes are not just places to live, they are assets in a portfolio, managed for yield, not stability. The price-to-rent ratio, which hovered around 13 in 2000, has climbed to 22 today. For renters, that means paying more for less security. For buyers, it means competing not just with neighbors, but with billion-dollar funds. Scarcity is not just a byproduct, it is the business model. But the real twist comes in how these incentives ripple out, shaping not just housing, but the entire logic of the modern economy. Shareholder primacy has become the silent script of the modern economy. In boardrooms and earnings calls, the question isn't how to make more or better, but how to extract more from what already exists. Corporate profits as a share of GDP have climbed from under 10% in the early 1970s to nearly 15% by the late 2010s, with projections reaching even higher in the coming decade. This isn't just a matter of luck or efficiency. It's the product of incentives engineered into the bones of the system. Companies pour billions into lobbying, over $5 billion in 2025 alone, to shape tax codes, regulations, and competition in their favor. Every dollar spent isn't about expanding supply or lowering prices for consumers. It's about protecting margins and fending off rivals. A behavioral economist describes it as a shift from expansion to extraction. Instead of building new factories or innovating products, firms focus on financial maneuvers, stock buybacks, dividend hikes, and cost-cutting. That often means fewer workers or higher prices. Private equity firms and conglomerates buy up competitors, wring out every possible yield, and then move on. The goal isn't to grow the pie, but to claim a bigger slice. This logic doesn't just shape boardrooms, it ripples out, creating a fragile supply system where efficiency trumps resilience, and where the cost of everyday life is quietly ratcheted upward. But the real consequences of these incentives are only beginning to show. In late 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, opening the door for a new era of global supply chains. Factories in Shenzhen and Suzhou began churning out everything from smartphones to sneakers, feeding a system that promised cheaper goods for everyone. But cheap came with a catch. By 2021, global semiconductor utilization had dropped to just 68%, leaving car makers and electronics firms scrambling for chips. A single missing component could freeze entire industries. When the Ever Given wedged itself in the Suez Canal, $9 billion of goods stalled each day. The world's dependence on a handful of ports, logistics hubs, and raw material choke points became painfully clear. The logic behind this system was simple: concentrate production, minimize inventory, trust that everything would arrive just in time. But the more efficient the chain, the more brittle it became. A disruption in one link, be it a pandemic, a factory fire, or a political standoff, sent shockwaves through shelves and wallets thousands of miles away. The promise of low prices had quietly traded away resilience. And the deeper irony? This fragile web did not just shape what was available, it rewired how people pay for access, convenience, and even the illusion of abundance. But the next twist would come not from what people buy, but how they are charged for simply existing in the system. A new kind of bill now shadows every paycheck. For a recent college graduate, the calendar is dotted with reminders. Spotify renews on the 3rd, cloud storage on the 8th, a fitness app on the 15th, and a coffee subscription quietly siphons $19.99 each month. What once felt like a luxury is now routine. The average American household manages nearly 3 paid subscriptions, a figure that has doubled in less than 10 years. Together, these recurring charges have swelled into a $140 billion market, growing at a pace that outstrips nearly every other category of spending. But the cost is not just financial. Each new subscription adds a layer of mental clutter, passwords, renewal dates, and price hikes hidden behind free trials. Psychologists call it decision fatigue, the slow grind of too many small choices, each one chipping away at attention and willpower. The promise was convenience, but the reality is a steady drain, both on bank accounts and on mental bandwidth. For the recent graduate, it is not just about budgeting. It is about navigating a maze of micro-obligations that never quite go away. And the strangest part? The system is designed for this, built to keep us always paying, always deciding, and never quite free. Three lines, moving in different directions, now define the story of modern life. The first is productivity, the measure of how much each worker can produce in an hour. Since the late 1970s, that line has soared upward, doubling and then some. Output per hour is up nearly 200%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The promise was simple. As technology advanced and efficiency improved, everyone would share in the gains. But the second line, real wages, barely budges. Adjusted for inflation, the typical worker's pay has inched up only about 5% since 1979. For most people, the experience is not of rising prosperity, but of running in place. Then there is the third line, housing costs. Unlike wages, the inflation-adjusted price of a home has shot up, especially since 2000. The Case-Shiller Index shows a 140% real increase over 2 decades. That gap between what workers produce, what they earn, and what it takes to secure a place to live is not an accident. It is the product of decades of policy, market incentives, and shifting power. The result is a system where the engine of productivity keeps accelerating, but the rewards flow elsewhere, while the cost of basic security drifts farther out of reach. The contradiction is right there in the data. Three lines that were once linked are now pulling apart. A notice taped to the apartment door. A phone call from the landlord. The quiet panic that comes when rent is due, and the numbers do not add up. In 2022, eviction filings in the United States topped 2.1 million, a spike of 40% in just 3 years. Each case is a data point, but behind the statistics are families packing boxes, children switching schools, and lives thrown into uncertainty. Nearly half of all renters now spend more than 30% of their income just to stay housed. For millions, the line between stability and crisis has thinned to a razor's edge. One tenant in Atlanta describes the feeling as a slow-motion landslide. She works full-time, picks up extra shifts, but rent keeps rising. Groceries cost more, the electricity bill creeps higher, and every month the margin shrinks. There is no cushion, no room for error. When the car breaks down or a child gets sick, the choice is simple. Pay the rent or risk losing everything. It is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it is the daily reality of living one crisis away from the street. This is the human side of the affordability crisis. The data is clear. 2.1 million eviction filings in a single year, nearly 50% of renters cost burdened. But the real story is quieter, more insidious. A constant background stress that shapes every decision, every plan for the future. The price of survival is no longer just financial. It is psychological, social, and deeply personal. And for many, the question is not just why everything is so expensive, it is how much longer they can hold on. Today, the cost of living is shaped less by chance and more by a web of incentives that reward complexity, dependency, and perpetual motion. As record lobbying and trillion-dollar debts reshape the landscape, the pressure isn't just on your wallet, it's on your sense of stability. The true price of modern life isn't only measured in dollars, but in the quiet erosion of security. What changes first, the system or us?